And by recognizing that each one of us are a miracle, that the world and that life, that things that we see and take for granted are in fact things that are very special, that are miraculous, one is able to start to understand that God, who is the all-powerful, omnipotent creator of all things, that He does miracles all the time.
Every man, woman, and child, so try. We
should recognize that we are walking miracles, that we are Hashem's beauty in the process of existence.
So try up those eyes, it's a whole new world, a brand new day, and the time of our joy has arrived.
The month of Av in the Jewish calendar commemorates the destruction of the two holy temples in Jerusalem, as well as countless other tragedies throughout Jewish history. The 17th of Tammuz is a fast day commemorating the fall of Jerusalem and also marks the beginning of a 3-week Jewish national period of mourning, leading up to Tisha B'Av, the day when the temples were actually destroyed. Rabbi Liebenberg explains the relevance of this period and why it is so significant to the Jewish people.
On the 17th day of the Jewish month of Tammuz begins the saddest period in the Jewish year. This is known as the 3 weeks of mourning, or in Hebrew, Bein HaMitzarim, which means between the narrow straits. This name comes from the book of Eicha, of Lamentations, which was written by the prophet Jeremiah. The prophet had the unfortunate experiencing of watching the first temple of Solomon destroyed and all of the Jews who lived in the province of Yehuda exiled to Babylon. At the beginning of the book, he says that all of these tragedies came upon us, Bein HaMitzarim. We were between the narrow straits. On one side was a strait, on the other side there was a strait. What are these narrow straits? The Talmud explains this is the period between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, both of which are days of national mourning and fasting and tragedy. Let's try to understand what happened on these days and what happened in between. First of all, the 17th of Tammuz. The Talmud tells us that there were 5 tragedies that happened on this day. The first tragedy that happened was in the times of Moses. He had gone up to Mount Sinai to receive the tablets, the 10 Commandments. He stayed on the mountain for 40 days, and when he came down, he saw that the Israelites were worshiping the golden calf. He smashed the tablets. The point being that in the tablets it says, I am one God. You shall have no other God besides me. And here, in this moment, the Jews had betrayed God, and therefore he smashed the tablets. That happened on the 17th of Tammuz. That was the first tragedy. Many years later, when the Jews already were living in Israel and the first temple of Solomon was built, they were besieged by enemies, the enemies of Babylon. And every single day, although they were besieged in the city of Jerusalem, they tried to keep up the sacrifices, the tamid, the daily sacrifices. But the sheep ran out, and this happened on the 17th of Tammuz. They had been bringing the sacrifice faithfully for 4 centuries, and on this day it stopped, and it was discontinued for the entire period of the first temple era. That was the second tragedy that befell the Jewish people on the 17th of Tammuz. The third tragedy is that the walls of the city were breached by the enemies. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came with his forces. They had besieged their city, and on the 17th of Tammuz, they were able to break through the walls. That's the third tragedy of the 17th of Tammuz. Later, there was a general, Apostomus, who burnt a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll. This was not just any Torah scroll. It was the master copy of the Torah scroll that was kept in the temple courtyard. And he burnt it. And of course, we know what happens when there is burning of books. First, books are burnt, and ultimately people are burnt. That was the fourth tragedy. And the fifth tragedy was that an idol was placed in the temple. The temple was a place of monotheism. There was only one God, and the enemies had placed this idol in the temple on the 17th of Tammuz. 3 weeks later, on the 9th of Av, a number of calamities took place. And again, the Talmud tells us that there were 5 calamities. Again, the first one was in the times of Moses. Moses had sent scouts, spies, 12 spies to the land of Israel to go and scout out and to come back with a report of what type of a country it was, how they were going to conquer it. But instead, 10 of the 12 spies came back with a negative, devastating report. And they said to the Israelites, there's no way we can go in there. It's not a good land. It consumes its people, its inhabitants. The people who live there are warriors. They're vicious. We can't go in. And the Torah tells us that the Jewish people cried by Lailahahu. They cried on that night. And what night was it? It was the 9th of Av. And God said, this will be a night on which you will cry through all generations. The second tragedy was the destruction of the temple, the first temple of Solomon, by the Babylonians. The third terrible calamity that befell the Jewish people on that day was the destruction of the second temple, the temple that had been built originally by Ezra and then later had been renovated by Herod, the great king, the great builder. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. But if that wasn't enough, later on the Jewish people actually tried to rebel against Rome. And the stronghold of a man named Bar Kokhba was in a place called Beitar, which was an enormous city. And on the 9th of Av, the Romans came and they massacred all of the people in Beitar, and the city fell. And then something else happened. The Romans, to add insult to injury, actually took the Temple Mount, which now, of course, didn't contain the temple, which they had burnt down, and they actually plowed it down. They lowered it down as if to say, this is no longer a holy place. And since that day, that tragic day, there has not been a temple on that site in Jerusalem. These were the 5 calamities that happened on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And it is for this reason that Jews commemorate this day as a day of fasting. They sit down on the ground like mourners. They don't wear leather shoes. They cry bitterly. They read prayers which are called kinot, dirges, in which they go through the whole of Jewish history and all of the different tragedies and plights that the Jewish people have gone through. This period became a period of national tragedy, and other tragedies happened during this time. And it's not coincidental. For example, during the golden era of Spain, the Jewish people had a wonderful life in Spain, but then came the Inquisition. Then came Torquemada and Queen Isabella and the king, and they expelled the Jews from Spain, never to return until about 500 years later. What day did this happen? Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, 1492. And again, the beginning of World War I, which of course led ultimately to World War II, also happened on Tisha B'Av. And it became a day of commemoration of Jewish tragedy for all time. But the Talmud asks an interesting question. It says, why was it that the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians? Why was it that the second temple was destroyed by the Romans? And of course we could say, well, the Babylonians were a stronger people. The Romans were a stronger empire. That's why it was destroyed. Well, what exactly is the Talmud asking? But the Talmud is also for a spiritual reason. How could God let it happen that his own house should be destroyed and violated by these people, by these colonialists, by these conquerors? And therefore it's looking for a spiritual reason. The Talmud tells us that in the times of the Babylonians, in the era towards the end of the first temple, the Israelites, the people living there, were engaged in terrible sins. The sin of murder, the sin of promiscuity, adultery, and idolatry. They had fallen from grace. And therefore God, as it were, left his home. It was just an empty shell. The enemy came and destroyed it. So in the times of the first temple, it was the 3 cardinal sins. But what about the times of the Second Temple? This was a wonderful time for the Jewish people. We read in the Talmud, and Josephus tells us that it was a time of incredible learning. The Jewish people at the time knew an amazing amount of Jewish law and philosophy and ethics. There was chesed, there was kindness, they were pious people. There was certainly no murder, and there was no idolatry, and there was no promiscuity. So why is it that the Romans were allowed to destroy the Holy Temple? And the Talmud tells us something very, very frightening. It says because there was sinat chinam, there was causeless, baseless hatred between people. And the great Rabbi Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel before the state was proclaimed, told us as follows. If it's true that all of this terrible destruction and exile and suffering befell the Jewish people because of baseless hatred, the only way that we can rebuild it is because of ahavat chinam, if there is baseless love between people. And therefore, in recent years, many rabbis have started to work and concentrate on these areas, specifically the laws of slander and gossip, that people shouldn't slander one another, that they shouldn't gossip, that they shouldn't hate one another for no reason, but they should try to come together. And in fact, the prophet Zechariah, who speaks about these fast days, says that a time will come in the future that what used to be a fast day, the fast of the 17th of Tammuz and the fast of the 9th of Av, will in fact turn into days of celebration and festivity. And it's very interesting that the month in which the fast of the 9th of Av falls, the month is called Av, and Av means a father, but it is also called Menachem Av, which means to comfort the father. It's the obligation of the Jewish people to try to comfort the father. But how do you comfort your parents? By showing your parents that you get on with your siblings. And if brothers and sisters can get on with one another, then the father is comforted, and he will once again return to his temple.
Hugh Reichlin is a lawyer who has a keen interest in Jewish communities around the world. Over the last decade, Hugh has traveled the globe in pursuit of his passion. Today, we continue with our mini-series, Heritage Travels with Hugh Reichlin, in which he explores the history of the Jewish community of Italy.
The Jews have a history in Italy that goes back over 2,000 years. The first migration to Italy was the Jews that came from Israel in about 161 BCE. That was the time of Judah the Maccabee, when he sent ambassadors across to Rome. There was another migration after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, a third migration during the time of Hadrian, which was approximately 135 of the Common Era, and then a fourth migration in 1492. That was after the Jews were expelled from Spain. There was a migration across Europe, and there was also a migration that went down into Italy. When we were in Milan, known as Milano for the Italians, we went to one of the synagogues, and we went inside and we sat down, and we were addressed by Rabbi Shunak. A young man and his family have been in Italy for approximately 2,000 years. And in fact, he traces his roots right back to the time of Judah the Maccabee. The Via Gustella synagogue, where we met Rabbi Shunak, was built in 1882. And he says that to this day they have at least 100 men praying in the synagogue every Sabbath. We said the afternoon service, we prayed the afternoon service, what we call mincha. And what was quite interesting was that many of us were observant Jews and we could hardly follow the service. And that was because the style of prayer in this particular synagogue was known as Nusach Italki, meaning it was a traditional Italian Jewish way of prayer, and they have their own prayer book. They have what's called Nusach Italki, which is a very special set of prayers and a way of arranging the prayers that is authentic to Italy. We also went to Rome, where we saw the Jewish community. They have a very big synagogue there, and they have probably the biggest Jewish community in the country. We also went to Venice, and that was the place of the famous Venice ghetto. Today there are approximately 500 Jews living in Venice, of which about 5 live in the old ghetto. In Venice, there are in fact 5 synagogues in the old ghetto, and they are named after the communities which used to live in the ghetto. There was the German synagogue, there is also the Spanish synagogue, there is the Levantine, that's the Middle Eastern Jews, and each of them are very small, and they have been restored by each of the communities over the years. All of them were built around in the 1500s, the middle 1500s to the early 1600s, and they still function today as synagogues. Not all of them are used at once, but they rotate so that each one has an opportunity to be used by the Jews in Venice. There is a functioning Jewish restaurant in Venice called the Gum Gum restaurant, and it was quite beautiful because when our tour group was sitting in the restaurant, there was a young English couple, a Jewish couple, that were there soon after their wedding, and we were able to celebrate their special wedding event with them just a couple of days after they had got married. We also went to the town of Padua, which was the birthplace of a most famous rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto of blessed memory. And it was a beautiful experience to be able to share with our group some of his teachings in his synagogue, which went back to the 16th century. The synagogue in Padua was hidden in a building. It was not really possible to see it from the street. And when one walked into it, it was very narrow, and it had beautiful wooden pews, and the walls were also lined with wood. And it was quite dark, but it certainly gave one the sense that one was walking into an ancient synagogue that had stood the test of time. While we were in Italy, just south of Rome, we went to a place called Ostia Antica. Nobody lives there today, and it's a city of ruins. But we were quite intrigued to see that amongst the ruins, there was a synagogue, or the remains of a synagogue. You could still see the pillars, you could still see part of the walls, and you could still see a partially intact mosaic floor. This particular synagogue is the oldest site of a synagogue in Western Europe today. It was built in the year 100 of the Common Era and has been there for 1900 years. It was only uncovered and discovered in 1961. And this was a very vibrant community. There were about 15,000 Jews in Ostia Antica. I understand that today there are approximately 20,000 Jews in the whole of Italy. Today, Italy is a place of freedom for the Jewish community. They are very patriotic Italians, but at the same time very proud Jews. And there are South Africans, there are many South African families that I know that have connections to Italy.